The autumn rain drummed against the tall windows of Clarence House as King Charles III sat in his private study, reviewing correspondence from Parliament. The crackling fireplace cast dancing shadows across the mahogany-paneled walls, creating an atmosphere of warmth that contrasted sharply with the tension brewing throughout the royal residence. Catherine, the Princess of Wales, had arrived earlier that evening for what was supposed to be a routine family dinner. Her elegant navy dress complemented her composed demeanor, though those who knew her well could detect the slight tension in her shoulders. She had come bearing troubling news that would shake the very foundations of the royal household. The media had been relentless in recent weeks, publishing increasingly invasive stories about the royal family's private affairs. However, what Catherine had discovered went far beyond typical tabloid speculation. Through her charitable work and connections within various organizations, she had uncovered evidence of systematic leaks coming from within their own circle. Someone close to the family was feeding intimate details to journalists, creating a breach of trust that threatened the monarchy's carefully maintained privacy. As Catherine sat across from Charles in the ornate drawing room, she carefully laid out documents and printed emails on the polished coffee table between them. The evidence was damning and pointed to a pattern of deliberate sabotage that had been occurring for months. Phone conversations had been recorded, private family moments had been photographed, and personal correspondence had somehow found its way into the hands of hostile media outlets. Charles studied each piece of evidence with growing concern, his weathered hands trembling slightly as he processed the implications. The betrayal cut deep because it involved someone they had trusted implicitly, someone who had been welcomed into their most intimate family gatherings, and privy to their deepest concerns about the future of the monarchy. The sound of heels clicking against marble flooring announced Camilla's approach long before she appeared in the doorway. The queen consort entered with her characteristic confident stride, immediately sensing the serious nature of the conversation taking place. Her eyes quickly scanned the documents spread across the table, and her expression shifted from casual curiosity to sharp alertness. Catherine maintained her composure as she began explaining her findings to Camilla, speaking in measured tones about the systematic nature of the leaks and the potential damage they could cause to the royal family's reputation. The evidence suggested that private conversations about succession planning, family health concerns, and internal disagreements had all been compromised. As the implications became clear, Camilla's demeanor began to change dramatically. The color drained from her face as she realized that some of the leaked information could only have come from sources very close to her personal circle. Her hands began to shake as she picked up various documents, scanning them with increasing agitation. The room's atmosphere grew heavy with unspoken accusations and mounting tension. Charles found himself in an impossible position, caught between his wife and his daughter-in-law as the evidence painted an increasingly clear picture of betrayal from within Camilla's trusted inner circle. Catherine continued her methodical presentation, pointing out timestamps on emails and cross-referencing them with private family events that had subsequently appeared in tabloid stories. The pattern was undeniable, and the source of the leaks was becoming increasingly apparent with each piece of evidence she revealed. Camilla's breathing became more labored as the full scope of the situation unfolded before her. The realization that people she had trusted completely had potentially betrayed the entire royal family was almost too much to bear. Her voice began to rise as she attempted to defend those in her circle, insisting there must be some other explanation for the coincidences. The conversation grew more heated as Catherine maintained her professional demeanor while presenting increasingly damning evidence. Charles watched in growing distress as two of the most important women in his life found themselves on opposite sides of a crisis that threatened to tear apart the carefully constructed harmony of their blended family. As the evening wore on, the weight of the evidence became impossible to ignore. Phone records, meeting schedules, and leaked stories all aligned in a pattern that pointed to deliberate and systematic betrayal. The trust that had taken years to build between the family members was cracking under the pressure of this revelation. Camilla's initial shock was rapidly transforming into defensive anger as she struggled to process the implications for her own reputation and relationships. The thought that her closest confidants might have been exploiting their access to the royal family for personal gain was devastating, and her emotional response was becoming increasingly volatile. The fire in the hearth continued to crackle softly, providing the only sound in the room during the long pauses between accusations and denials. Outside, the rain had intensified, matching the growing storm within the walls of Clarence House as 3 generations of royalty grappled with a crisis that would test their bonds like never before. Charles could see the pain in Catherine's eyes as she maintained her composure despite the personal cost of bringing this information forward. He also witnessed the anguish in Camilla's face as she realized the devastating implications for her own circle of trust. The king found himself at the center of a crisis that required careful navigation to prevent permanent damage to the family he was sworn to protect. The evidence continued to mount as Catherine revealed additional documentation she had gathered through her careful investigation. Security footage, phone records, and witness testimonies all supported her conclusions about the systematic nature of the breaches. The professional thoroughness of her presentation only served to make the accusations more credible and the situation more dire. As the evening progressed toward its climactic confrontation, the 3 royals sat surrounded by the damning evidence of betrayal that would forever change their relationships with those they had trusted most. The stage was set for a confrontation that would test not only their individual characters, but also their commitment to protecting the institution of the monarchy itself. The grandfather clock in the corner of the drawing room chimed 11 as Catherine reached into her leather portfolio and withdrew what would prove to be the most damaging piece of evidence yet. The document was a series of bank statements and money transfer records that showed substantial payments made to individuals within Camilla's personal staff over the past 6 months. Charles leaned forward in his burgundy leather chair, adjusting his reading glasses as Catherine explained how she had discovered these financial irregularities through her work with various charitable organizations. One of the recipients of the suspicious payments had been careless enough to deposit checks while attending a charity event where Catherine was present, leading to questions that eventually unraveled the entire scheme. The payments corresponded exactly with the timing of major media leaks about the royal family's private affairs. Each substantial transfer was followed within days by exclusive stories in tabloid newspapers that revealed intimate details about family gatherings, private conversations, and personal struggles that should never have become public knowledge. Camilla's hands trembled as she examined the bank statements, recognizing the names of people she had considered among her closest and most trusted allies. These were individuals who had been with her through her most difficult times, who had supported her during the challenging transition from mistress to wife to queen consort. The betrayal cut deeper than any public criticism she had ever endured. Catherine continued her methodical presentation, explaining how the investigation had revealed a sophisticated network of information gathering and distribution. Personal assistants were recording private conversations, housekeeping staff were photographing private correspondence, and even security personnel had been compromised by the promise of substantial financial rewards. The evidence showed that intimate details about Prince William's concerns over his father's health, private discussions about succession planning, and even personal family arguments had all been carefully documented and sold to the highest-bidding media outlets. The royal family's most private moments had become commodities in a marketplace of scandal and invasion. As the full scope of the betrayal became clear, Camilla's composure began to crack completely. The woman who had weathered decades of public scrutiny and media attacks found herself facing a betrayal that struck at the very heart of her ability to trust those closest to her. Her voice rose to a near shriek as she demanded to know how Catherine had obtained such detailed financial information. Charles found himself witnessing a side of his wife that he had rarely seen, even during their most difficult periods together. The controlled, dignified public persona that Camilla had carefully cultivated over decades was dissolving before his eyes as the reality of the situation overwhelmed her emotional defenses. Catherine maintained her professional demeanor as she explained the legal methods she had used to trace the financial transactions, emphasizing that everything had been done with proper authorization and oversight. Her background in art history had taught her the importance of meticulous research and documentation, skills that had served her well in uncovering this complex web of betrayal. The conversation grew more heated as Camilla began to realize that the investigation had been ongoing for several weeks without her knowledge. The fact that Catherine and potentially others within the royal household had been gathering evidence about her personal staff felt like a betrayal in itself, adding another layer of complexity to an already explosive situation. Charles watched in growing distress as the 2 women he loved most found themselves in increasingly adversarial positions. His role as both husband and father figure placed him in an impossible situation where any attempt to mediate would inevitably be seen as taking sides in a conflict that threatened to tear apart the carefully constructed harmony of their blended family. The evidence revealed that some of the most damaging leaks had occurred during family gatherings at Sandringham and Balmoral, times when the royals believed they were safe from public scrutiny and could speak freely about their concerns and hopes for the future. The violation of these sacred family spaces made the betrayal even more personally devastating. Camilla's voice began to crack as she realized that conversations she had shared with Charles about their fears for the future of the monarchy, their concerns about public opinion, and their private struggles with the demands of royal life had all potentially been recorded and sold to tabloid journalists seeking sensational stories about royal dysfunction. The financial records showed payments totaling hundreds of thousands of pounds, indicating that the scheme had been both sophisticated and extremely profitable for those involved. The amounts were substantial enough to suggest that this was not simply opportunistic gossip, but rather a carefully planned and executed operation designed to maximize both financial gain and damage to the royal family's reputation. As Catherine continued to present evidence, it became clear that the leaks had been timed to coincide with important royal events and announcements, maximizing their impact on public perception and media coverage. State visits, charity galas, and family celebrations had all been undermined by strategically released private information that cast the royals in an unfavorable light. The room's atmosphere grew increasingly tense as Camilla struggled to process the implications of the evidence being presented. Her breathing became more labored, and her voice began to take on a shrill quality that neither Charles nor Catherine had heard before. The controlled, dignified woman they knew was being replaced by someone driven to the edge by betrayal and humiliation. Charles found himself remembering similar moments from his first marriage when private conversations and intimate details had found their way into public discourse, causing immense pain and damage to relationships he had valued. The parallel was not lost on him, and he could see the devastating effect that this betrayal was having on Camilla's sense of security and trust. The evidence also revealed that some of the leaked information had been deliberately distorted or taken out of context to create more sensational stories. Private expressions of concern or frustration had been twisted into narratives of dysfunction and discord that painted the royal family in the worst possible light. As the night wore on, the weight of the evidence became impossible to deny or explain away. Phone records, financial transactions, and leaked stories all formed a pattern of deliberate betrayal that had been orchestrating from within Camilla's own circle of trust. The woman who had fought so hard to earn her place within the royal family was now facing the devastating realization that her closest allies had been systematically undermining everything she had worked to achieve. The grandfather clock continued its steady ticking, marking the passage of time as three members of the royal family grappled with a crisis that would forever change their relationships with those they had trusted most. The evidence spread across the coffee table told a story of betrayal, greed, and systematic violation of privacy that struck at the very heart of what it meant to be part of the modern royal family. Catherine's thorough investigation had revealed not just isolated incidents of gossip or indiscretion, but rather a comprehensive operation designed to monetize the royal family's private lives for substantial financial gain. The professionalism and scope of the scheme made it clear that this was not simply a matter of loose tongues or careless servants, but rather a deliberate and calculated attack on the institution of the monarchy itself. The revelation of the final piece of evidence proved to be the breaking point that shattered Camilla's remaining composure completely. Catherine had discovered that the betrayal included recordings of private telephone conversations between Camilla and her children from her first marriage, conversations in which she had shared her deepest fears about her role as queen consort and her concerns about public acceptance. The recordings had been made by someone with access to the secure telephone lines at Clarence House, indicating that the breach of security went far deeper than anyone had initially suspected. These were not casual conversations overheard by passing staff members, but deliberate recordings made using sophisticated equipment that required significant planning and technical expertise. Camilla's face went completely white as she realized that her most vulnerable moments, including conversations where she had broken down crying about the pressures of royal life and her fears about living up to Diana's legacy, had been captured and potentially sold to media outlets known for their hostile coverage of the royal family. The emotional dam that Camilla had carefully constructed over decades of public scrutiny finally burst as she processed the full implications of this ultimate violation of privacy. Her voice rose to a pitch that neither Charles nor Catherine had ever heard before, a sound of pure anguish that seemed to come from the deepest parts of her soul. She began pacing frantically around the room, her hands shaking uncontrollably as she picked up documents and threw them down again in frustration. The elegant woman who had spent years mastering the art of royal composure was completely unraveling before their eyes, revealing the vulnerable human being beneath the carefully constructed public persona. Charles rose from his chair and attempted to approach his wife, but she recoiled from his touch as if it burned. The breakdown was so complete and overwhelming that she seemed unable to distinguish between friend and foe, seeing potential betrayal in every gesture and word. Her trust in everything and everyone around her had been so thoroughly destroyed that she could no longer accept comfort even from those who loved her most. The screaming began as a low moan of anguish, but quickly escalated into something primal and terrifying. Camilla's voice cracked and strained as she gave voice to years of suppressed fear, anger, and vulnerability that she had never allowed herself to express publicly. The sound echoed through the corridors of Clarence House, causing staff members to stop in their tracks and exchange worried glances. Catherine remained seated throughout the outburst, maintaining her composure while watching with a mixture of sympathy and determination as the woman she had worked so hard to develop a relationship with completely fell apart before her eyes. The princess understood that this was the inevitable result of presenting such devastating evidence, but she also knew that the truth had to come out for the sake of the entire family. Camilla's accusations began flying in all directions as her rational mind gave way to raw emotion and desperate self-defense. She accused Catherine of orchestrating an elaborate setup designed to destroy her reputation and drive her from the royal family. The paranoia that had been building throughout the evening finally erupted into full-blown conspiracy theories about plots and schemes designed to undermine her position. The breakdown was so intense that it seemed to transform Camilla into someone completely unrecognizable. The woman who had charmed world leaders and navigated the complexities of royal protocol with grace and skill was replaced by someone driven to the edge by betrayal and humiliation. Her voice became increasingly shrill and incoherent as she struggled to process emotions that had been building for years. Charles found himself watching helplessly as his wife descended into an emotional crisis that seemed to threaten not only their marriage but her very sanity. The controlled, dignified woman he had fallen in love with was disappearing before his eyes, replaced by someone consumed by rage, fear, and desperate vulnerability. The screaming continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, filling the elegant room with sounds of anguish that seemed completely at odds with the refined surroundings. Priceless artwork and antique furniture bore witness to a human breakdown that stripped away all pretense and revealed the raw emotional cost of life under constant public scrutiny. As Camilla's voice began to crack and fail from the strain of her outburst, her accusations became even more wild and desperate. She claimed that the entire investigation was part of a larger conspiracy to remove her from the royal family and restore Diana's memory to prominence. The rational understanding that Diana had been dead for decades seemed to have no impact on her desperate need to find someone to blame for her current anguish. Catherine watched with growing concern as the breakdown continued to escalate beyond anything she had anticipated when she decided to bring forward the evidence of betrayal. While she had expected anger and denial, she had not prepared for this complete psychological collapse that seemed to threaten Camilla's fundamental ability to distinguish reality from paranoid fantasy. The sound of running footsteps in the corridor outside indicated that the household staff were becoming increasingly alarmed by the screaming coming from the drawing room. Charles made urgent gestures toward the door, silently communicating that no one should enter during this deeply private family crisis that was already devastating enough without becoming a public spectacle. Camilla's breathing became increasingly erratic as her body struggled to cope with the intense emotional and physical stress of the breakdown. Her face was flushed red with exertion and emotion, and perspiration had begun to stain her elegant silk blouse as she continued to pace frantically around the room like a caged animal. The accusations against Catherine became increasingly personal and vicious as Camilla's rational mind completely gave way to emotional desperation. She accused the younger woman of jealousy, ambition, and calculated cruelty designed to elevate her own position within the royal hierarchy by destroying those who stood in her way. Charles finally found his voice and attempted to intervene, speaking in soothing tones about the need to address the situation calmly and rationally. However, his words seemed to have no impact on his wife's emotional state, and, if anything, his attempt at mediation seemed to enrage her further as she accused him of choosing Catherine over her. The breakdown reached its crescendo as Camilla began to hyperventilate, her breathing becoming so rapid and shallow that she seemed in danger of losing consciousness. The combination of emotional shock, physical exertion from pacing and screaming, and the overwhelming sense of betrayal had pushed her body beyond its limits. Catherine finally rose from her chair and moved toward the door, recognizing that her continued presence was only making the situation worse. However, her movement seemed to trigger an even more intense response from Camilla, who interpreted the gesture as evidence of guilt or an attempt to escape accountability for the devastation she had caused. The elegant drawing room that had witnessed so many important conversations and decisions throughout royal history was now the scene of a complete psychological breakdown that threatened to destroy relationships and reputations that had taken decades to build. The evidence of systematic betrayal lay scattered across the coffee table, forgotten in the immediate crisis of dealing with Camilla's emotional collapse. As the screaming continued to echo through the corridors of Clarence House, it became clear that this was more than just an emotional outburst triggered by shocking revelations. This was the complete unraveling of a woman who had spent years suppressing her deepest fears and vulnerabilities in service to an institution that demanded perfection and composure at all times. The moment that would define Charles's character and his commitment to justice came as Camilla's screaming reached its most intense peak, her voice cracking with the strain of accusation and desperation. The king, who had remained largely silent throughout the evening's revelations, finally rose from his chair with a dignity and authority that commanded immediate attention from both women in the room. His voice, when it came, carried the weight of decades of royal training and the unmistakable tone of sovereign authority that had been cultivated through years of preparation for the crown. Charles spoke with a clarity and firmness that cut through Camilla's hysteria like a blade, demanding silence and attention through the sheer force of his presence and conviction. The transformation in Charles was remarkable to witness. The gentle, sometimes uncertain man who had often deferred to stronger personalities throughout his life was replaced by a monarch who understood that this moment required decisive leadership and unwavering moral courage. His years of waiting to assume the throne had prepared him for difficult decisions, but nothing had quite prepared him for this test of his character. Charles addressed Camilla directly, his voice filled with compassion but absolutely unwavering in its conviction that the evidence presented by Catherine was both credible and damning. He acknowledged his wife's pain and shock while making it clear that the facts could not be ignored or dismissed simply because they were uncomfortable or personally devastating. The king's words carried the weight of someone who had experienced his own share of betrayal and media intrusion throughout his life. He spoke from a place of understanding about the pain of having private conversations exposed to public scrutiny, but he also demonstrated a moral clarity that distinguished between being a victim and being complicit in victimizing others. As Charles continued to speak, his support for Catherine's investigation became increasingly explicit and unwavering. He praised her courage in bringing forward such difficult evidence, and acknowledged the personal cost she had paid to expose the systematic betrayal that had been occurring within their household. His words made it clear that he viewed her actions as those of someone protecting the institution of the monarchy rather than attacking it. The king's defense of Catherine was not merely political or strategic, but deeply personal, reflecting his understanding of her character and his respect for her commitment to the royal family's well-being. He spoke about her years of dedicated service, her careful navigation of complex family dynamics, and her unwavering loyalty to the institution she had married into. Charles's voice grew stronger and more authoritative as he addressed each of Camilla's accusations against Catherine, systematically dismantling the conspiracy theories and paranoid fantasies that had emerged during her breakdown. His response demonstrated both his analytical mind and his deep understanding of the people involved in the crisis. The moment was particularly powerful because Charles was essentially choosing between his wife and his daughter-in-law on a matter of fundamental principle. His decision to support Catherine's position, despite the obvious personal cost to his marriage, demonstrated a level of moral courage that surprised even those who thought they knew him well. Charles made it clear that the betrayal revealed by Catherine's investigation represented an attack on the monarchy itself, not just on individual members of the royal family. His response showed that he understood the broader implications of the security breaches and the systematic violation of privacy that had been occurring under his own roof. The king's words also revealed his deep anger at having been manipulated and deceived by people he had trusted. His usual diplomatic language gave way to more direct expressions of disappointment and determination to ensure that those responsible for the betrayals would face appropriate consequences for their actions. As Camilla's screaming gradually subsided into quiet sobbing, Charles maintained his position of support for Catherine while also expressing genuine sympathy for his wife's emotional distress. He demonstrated the complex balancing act required of a leader who must uphold justice while also showing compassion for those who have been hurt by the consequences of that justice. The king's intervention marked a turning point in the crisis, shifting the focus from accusations and denials to practical questions about how to address the security breaches and hold accountable those who had violated the family's trust. His leadership transformed a destructive emotional confrontation into a more productive discussion about protection and justice. Charles also addressed the broader implications of the betrayal for the royal family's future security and privacy. He spoke about the need to completely review their household procedures and staff vetting processes to prevent similar breaches from occurring in the future. His response showed both immediate concern for addressing the current crisis and long-term strategic thinking about protecting the monarchy. The king's support for Catherine extended beyond the immediate crisis to encompass a broader recognition of her role within the royal family and her importance to its future success. His words suggested that he viewed her not just as his son's wife, but as a crucial partner in the work of maintaining and modernizing the monarchy for future generations. Throughout his intervention, Charles demonstrated the kind of moral leadership that had often been questioned during his years as heir to the throne. His willingness to stand up for what was right, even when it meant confronting his own wife, showed a strength of character that commanded respect from both Catherine and the household staff, who could hear his voice echoing through the corridors. The king's response also revealed his understanding that the monarchy's survival depended on maintaining the trust and respect of the British people, something that could only be achieved through transparency, accountability, and a commitment to the highest ethical standards. His defense of Catherine was ultimately a defense of these principles. Charles made it clear that the investigation would continue until all aspects of the betrayal had been uncovered and addressed. His commitment to following the evidence wherever it led demonstrated a determination to clean house completely, regardless of the personal relationships that might be damaged in the process. The authority in Charles's voice grew stronger as he outlined the immediate steps that would be taken to secure the household and prevent further breaches of privacy. His transformation from uncertain husband to decisive monarch was complete, and his words carried the unmistakable weight of royal command that would not be questioned or ignored. As the evening's crisis reached this crucial turning point, it became clear that Charles's intervention had fundamentally changed the dynamics of the situation. His unwavering support for Catherine and his commitment to justice had created a new reality that Camilla would have to accept, regardless of her personal feelings about the devastating revelations that had been brought to light. The king's stand represented more than just a resolution to an immediate family crisis. It was a defining moment that would shape his reign and establish the moral foundation upon which he intended to lead both his family and his nation through the challenges that lay ahead. The immediate aftermath of Charles's decisive intervention created a profound and telling silence that settled over the drawing room like a heavy blanket. The only sounds were the soft crackling of the dying fire in the hearth and Camilla's gradually subsiding sobs as she slowly began to process the reality of her husband's unwavering support for Catherine's position. The silence stretched on for several minutes, during which the three royal family members each grappled with the implications of what had just transpired. Charles remained standing in his position of authority, his hands clasped behind his back in the classic royal pose that signaled both dignity and determination. His expression was grave but resolute, showing no sign of wavering from the position he had taken. Catherine maintained her seated position, her hands folded carefully in her lap as she processed the unexpected but complete support she had received from her father-in-law. The validation of her investigation and her courage in bringing forward such devastating evidence was overwhelming, and she struggled to maintain her composure in the face of such a powerful endorsement from the monarch himself. Camilla had collapsed into an ornate chair near the window, her earlier hysteria replaced by a kind of shocked numbness as she began to understand that her emotional breakdown had not changed the fundamental facts of the situation. The evidence of betrayal remained spread across the coffee table, and her husband's support for Catherine's position meant that there would be no escape from the consequences of what had been revealed. The quality of the silence was profound and meaningful, representing a complete shift in the power dynamics within the royal household. Charles's intervention had not only ended Camilla's emotional outburst, but had also established a new hierarchy of trust and authority that would govern their relationships going forward. As the minutes passed without anyone speaking, the silence began to take on an almost ceremonial quality, as if the room itself was bearing witness to a historic moment in the monarchy's evolution. The grandfather clock continued its steady ticking, marking the passage of time as 3 generations of royals processed the events that would forever change their understanding of loyalty, betrayal, and justice. Catherine was the first to break the silence, speaking in a voice that was quiet but steady as she expressed her gratitude to Charles for his support and his commitment to uncovering the truth regardless of the personal cost. Her words were carefully chosen and delivered with the grace and dignity that had made her such a valuable addition to the royal family. Charles responded with equal gravity, acknowledging the difficulty of the situation while reaffirming his commitment to following the investigation to its conclusion. His words made it clear that this was not just about addressing current security breaches, but about establishing principles that would guide the monarchy's conduct in all future situations involving questions of trust and accountability. The king's response also included a direct address to Camilla, spoken with compassion but absolute firmness about the need to cooperate fully with the ongoing investigation and to accept responsibility for the actions of those within her circle who had betrayed the family's trust. His words were not harsh, but they left no room for doubt about what would be required going forward. Camilla's response, when it finally came, was barely audible and filled with a kind of broken acceptance that suggested she understood the futility of further resistance. Her voice was hoarse from screaming, and her words carried the weight of someone who had lost everything she thought she could rely on for security and support. The conversation that followed was conducted in hushed tones that stood in stark contrast to the emotional explosions that had characterized the earlier part of the evening. Each word was carefully weighed and considered, as all 3 participants understood that they were essentially rebuilding their relationships from the ground up based on new understandings about truth, loyalty, and accountability. Charles outlined the practical steps that would be taken immediately to address the security breaches and begin the process of holding accountable those who had violated the family's trust. His words were delivered with the authority of someone who had made irreversible decisions and was prepared to face whatever consequences might follow from those choices. The investigation would be expanded and professionalized, with external security experts brought in to conduct a comprehensive review of all household procedures and personnel. No one would be above suspicion, and no relationship would be considered too important to sacrifice in service of uncovering the complete truth about the systematic betrayals that had been occurring. Catherine was tasked with continuing to serve as a liaison with the investigation, her careful work and attention to detail having proven invaluable in uncovering the initial evidence of betrayal. Charles's confidence in her abilities and judgment was made explicitly clear, further cementing her position within the family hierarchy and her role in protecting the monarchy's future. The financial implications of the revelations were also addressed, with Charles making it clear that civil and potentially criminal proceedings would be pursued against all those who had accepted payment for violating the family's privacy. The monarchy's resources would be used to ensure that justice was served and that a strong message was sent to anyone who might consider similar betrayals in the future. As the evening drew toward its close, the silence returned, but now it carried a different quality. Where earlier it had been heavy with tension and uncertainty, it now felt more like the calm that follows a storm, suggesting that while damage had been done, the worst of the crisis had passed and healing could begin. The 3 royals began to discuss practical arrangements for the immediate future, including how to manage the ongoing investigation while maintaining the normal functions of royal life. The conversation was professional and focused, showing how quickly they had all adapted to the new reality created by the evening's revelations and decisions. Charles made it clear that while personal relationships might be strained by recent events, the work of the monarchy would continue without interruption. His words suggested a mature understanding that private conflicts could not be allowed to interfere with public duties and responsibilities. The final moments of the evening were marked by formal expressions of mutual respect and commitment to working together despite the personal costs of the truth that had been revealed. Each participant acknowledged the difficulty of the situation while also expressing determination to emerge stronger and more secure from the crisis. As Catherine prepared to leave Clarence House and return to her own residence, the silence that had dominated the latter part of the evening felt almost sacred in its weight and significance. The events of the night had tested every relationship in the room and had ultimately revealed truths about character, loyalty, and moral courage that would shape the monarchy for years to come. The dying embers in the fireplace cast long shadows across the room as the three royals said their formal goodbyes, each understanding that while they would continue to work together and maintain family relationships, something fundamental had changed in their dynamic that could never be fully restored to its previous state. The silence that followed Catherine's departure spoke volumes about the isolation that Camilla now faced within her own household, having lost the trust of those she had relied upon most while also facing the consequences of her emotional breakdown in the face of overwhelming evidence. The queen consort was left to contemplate a future in which her position, while secure in title, had been fundamentally altered in terms of influence and trust.